Hi guys, thank you very much for joining us. Before we start with this episode, I would firstly like to apologise. I was testing out some new software that did work on the trial. However, during the interview, for some reason, it flaked out and the audio quality has kind of suffered. You can still make out everything, and the guest does share some fantastic knowledge, so it's still worth listening to the episode. I just want to declare that the quality of the content held here is not representative of the rest of the series we do. I have since bought some new microphones to improve this audio quality, and I hope you can notice that in the further episodes that we do. But thank you very much, guys. Enjoy the show.
Ace Podcast.
And welcome to another episode from Series 1 of Vaguely Accurate, the science show where we learn from the next generation of scientists. I'm your host, DK, and today on the show we have a speech pathologist, Claire. Hi.
Hello.
Hi. So could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what is speech pathology?
Oh, gosh, that's a hard one. My name's Claire. I just qualified as a speech pathologist. Amazingly.
Congratulations. Done.
So I did my honours degree as a part of my final year of the undergrad in speech. Mm-hmm. Going into what is speech pathology, I get asked that a lot. And it's really hard to answer because it's a really, really varied profession. And there's a lot of sort of, you don't want to go closer.
No, that's okay. That's cool.
There's a lot of talk within the community about what we call ourselves. I mean, obviously in Australia we're called speech pathologists. Mm-hmm. In the UK we're speech language therapists. Mm-hmm. In the US we're speech language pathologists. So it's a bit of controversy about how well that represents what we actually do, because it's not just about speech.
Yeah.
So I guess the technical definition is that we assess, we diagnose, and we treat communication and swallowing disorders.
Okay.
Yes. So swallowing is in there as well.
Swallowing's in there as well.
Isn't that interesting?
Does it come under allied health then?
Yes.
It does?
Yes. We are an allied health profession along with physios and OTs. We work in quite close quarters with OTs, with physios, especially in the disability services area, but also with dietitians when it comes to the swallowing side of things as well.
So what were you interested in speech pathology?
Again, that's a hard one. There's a couple of girls that I went to uni with that had brothers or other kids in their lives that had speech services when they were younger. Mm-hmm. But I didn't even know it existed. I actually went to performing arts school and I did drama. I thought I was going to be an actor, funnily enough. I went and started a degree in public relations and hated that, and then just decided to take some time off. And I always thought to myself, look, if I ever did a science, which to me was unthinkable, science, God no. If I ever did a science, I'd want to learn about, how we make sound with, how we make our voices and how all this mechanics works when it comes to speech and communication. I always found that really interesting.
So you took away almost your passion for acting and wanting to perform to learning how the body does it itself.
I guess so, yeah. I didn't ever know that it was a thing. I didn't know that speech pathology was a profession. I went overseas and I taught English to little Italian kids, and I did a bit of work as a special needs EA at a primary school, and that's, sort of all related. And then I sort of started looking into degrees and things and found, funnily enough, speech pathology is a thing, and I can learn about how we make the voice and how we make speech and how we communicate, and not only that, I can treat that and help people with it. So I think that was what attracted me to it, the fact that I did, sort of PR before, and that was such a corporate sort of a thing, and I hated that. And then I found this thing that's a really helping profession. Yeah. And I think that's really what drew me to it, and the fact that it's so varied as well. I mean, I've got a whole load of notes on what it is that we actually do. I mean, that was so like base level as to what we actually do, but I could give you some examples. And
go for it. Give us a few examples, and then we'll go into your research.
Okay, sure. So we work with a lot of different people. People who have difficulties that arise from birth. So that might be disabilities like cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, autism spectrum disorder, hearing impairments, and cleft lip and palate as well. We work with children who've had cleft lip and palate.
So what is that?
So if you've ever seen someone with a hair lip, they call it.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So you've seen they have a scar just above their lip, slightly off to one side. So these are children that are born with the hard part on the roof of your mouth is called your hard palate. Okay. Your soft palate is further back. You can actually feel it with your tongue if you put your tongue up on the roof of your mouth. So that's your hard palate. It's actually bone. And these children, it's hard on the roof of your mouth. Yeah. That actually separates the cavity that's up here in your nose from the cavity that's down here in your mouth. Some children are born without that being fused together, because that actually fuses together when you're in utero. It comes together in the middle. Yeah. Some children that doesn't actually happen in varying degrees as well. So you can have a cleft palate where it's just that and your lips are actually intact and you just have a hole that you can actually put your finger through your nose and into your mouth. And so there's just a hole there. And you can imagine what troubles that would have with speech, because we use that hard part at the top of our mouth to create a lot of sounds. With feeding, really, really bad with feeding, because there's a lot of possibility of bacteria getting in there, and also we use that to mush the food up against the roof of our mouth as well when we chew. Yeah. So a whole range of problems that can come from that. And then you can also have a cleft lip as well, which is where the lip hasn't actually fused together, and it's quite disabling. And these children, once they have the surgery, which is incredible, absolutely incredible what these surgeons do, it's insane. But once they actually fuse that together, these children actually have to be able to learn to speak and to learn how to feed properly. So that's where we come.
So how old are these children when they're having surgery?
They aren't allowed to have surgery until they have, I think it's a year or 18 months old, because before that it's just too dangerous. Yep. They're too young, they're still developing. So the surgeons won't actually do anything until they're a year or 18 months old. Some of them, in some countries, some third world countries, it might not happen until they're in their adolescence. But it still can be done. It's amazing what they do. So, there's actually a program in India, funnily enough, for reasons that are unknown to us. The population of children born with cleft lip and palate in India is high, very, very high compared to the rest of the world.
That is bizarre.
We don't know why. Culturally, maybe it's something to do with malnutrition in their parents when they were younger, or different bacteria around. We don't know.
Is this a modern thing?
Yes. Okay. So it's new, but there's actually a program that sends surgeons over into India. They go out and they advertise this with flyers and things like that in the big cities, and they go out to the small towns and they find these children who have cleft lip and palate. And in India, incredibly culturally bad for a child to have that, to be born like that. They can't speak properly, they can't eat properly, they're very, very disabled, and these are people who might get to their adulthood having never had it treated, and they can't get married. If they're girls, then their life is over pretty much if they're in rural India, because culturally they won't be able to get married, they won't have anyone to take care of them. For men, they might not be able to find work. Some people are shunned from their families. For others, they think that it's a curse.
So it's almost very, very stigmatised.
Very stigmatised, yeah. And it's interesting that I'm talking about this, because that actually flows into my research, talking about
Let's
stigma.
Let's take that segue.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
So tell us a little bit, so what is the title of your project first, and then we'll go into what motivated you to choose this as a focus before moving on to your methodology.
Yeah, cool. So the title is The Experiences of Migrants to Australia Who Stutter. Okay. And I will have to give a little bit of background on some things to sort of explain the study itself. As for why I got into the area, I am a member of the Speakeasy Association, which is actually where we sampled our participants from. Speakeasy Association is a self-help support group for adults who stutter.
Yeah.
They have branches all over the world. In Australia, I've got one in every state, so this one's for WA, and one of my lecturers was advertising for a project that she was starting. It's a project that I've taken on now. But luckily, like me, she was pregnant.
I think she might find that quite nice and lucky.
Yeah, probably, yeah. But yeah, so she'd advertised, and I said, look, that looks really interesting to me. I'm fascinated by bilingualism. I'm fascinated by, we call it fluency in speech pathology rather than stuttering. It's the area of fluency that we work in. I'm fascinated by that. I'm fascinated by sort of just anything international. I think like bilingual speakers, migrants, all that sort of thing. I thought it was really, really interesting. And the fact that it was a qualitative study as well is what got me interested. But yeah, I guess getting back to, how I got in, my lecturer was pregnant. She needed someone to come on and take over the project. And I said, well, I'm doing honours. And it's a qualitative study. I would really, really love the opportunity to be able to talk to people and hear their stories. And I think that's what you're talking about when you say that people who go into clinical health professions don't necessarily do research. And I think that's because, we're in a helping profession, we like to be very people-focused.
Yeah.
And, not customer, but, client-facing role. And this is the opportunity for me to be able to do that, but also with research.
Yeah.
So I got to have, unfortunately, I didn't actually get to do the interviews, which is what I would love to have done.
That's a shame.
It is a real shame. Hopefully if I do a PhD, then maybe I'll get to do that myself. But at the same time, I still got to listen to these stories and really immerse myself in these experiences, and that's the whole point of the study itself, is that, yes, we do have a lot of quantitative data. We're looking at stuttering in a way that's more neurological than we ever have in the past. We're looking at it as a motor disorder. That is neurologically based, but very, very highly impacted by psychology.
Is stuttering? So stuttering isn't a physical condition itself. You get physical product but itself, is it mostly neurological? You say it's starting to look at more neurological. So that there's two aspects of it, or have we only just started to conclude that maybe it's more neurological and we should start looking for physical deformities? That could be.
The thing with stuttering is that it's not had the research it needs. The early definitions and the early research and the early treatment of stuttering surrounded around the idea that if you told a child that he stutters, he will stutter. So in the early days, and I'm talking a long time ago, 100 years ago, it was the fault of the parent who had told their child that they stuttered, because we all have disfluencies. That's the interesting part. When you listen back to this interview, if you were to transcribe it verbatim, both of us would have ums and ahs, we'd repeat words, repeat sounds.
So much editing every show. I've noticed I do it a lot.
Exactly. So we will all naturally have disfluencies in our speech, up to about 1% of the speech that we have. That's quite normal. Mm-hmm. And everyone will have that. Over 3%, we might diagnose that as clinical stuttering.
Okay.
There are a number of different ways that you can stutter. So there are three sort of main ways that you can stutter. There's sort of the early stuttering is in repetition. So you might repeat. I just did repeat.
Yeah.
I repeat a part of a word. You might repeat a full word. And so you'll hear that a lot in the traditional idea of stuttering, when it's stuttering. Yeah. There's prolongations up from that, which is a little bit sort of extended, I think more severe, and that's where you hear the extension of words, of sounds. So you hear a stuttering, extendedness, and then the really, really severe is the blocks, and that's when people can't get the words out, and you'll hear it come out in a real.
So what is the difference? Causes. What are the different causes? Mm-hmm. I'm doing it now. Now you point it out. It's just happening.
It does. I think I feel it. We started studying this.
But now, what are the root causes of the three different? Is it similar, just a different severity of a physiological or neurological condition?
Yeah.
Or is it a completely different?
Yeah. Again, like I said, there's not enough research into it. And like I said, early on, it was really focused on a psychological disorder.
Yeah.
It's still seen in some circles, in psych circles, as a psychological disorder. But the work that we're doing into it now is that it is highly, highly impacted by psychology, which is what I'm looking at in my study. But we're seeing it more as we're seeing genetic links.
Okay.
As well, keeping in mind that the ratio is about 1 to 3 more males who stutter more than females. So it's actually quite rare to see a female who stutters.
And I guess they don't know that.
I don't know why.
That'd be interesting.
But we're looking into the genetics now, so we're thinking of that being passed down from father to son. You'll often hear if it's a male who stutters, it's likely he'll have a male who stuttered. Whether it's his father or his brother, something like that. So we're seeing a genetic link, and we're seeing more and more that it's possibly neurological, and that it's impacted by the environment, it's impacted by the psychology. So there's a lot of different things coming into it, but there's a neurological basis to it. All of these factors have to come together to create a serious stutter. But we're seeing a neurological basis to it now, rather than being, just a nervous disorder or something like that. It's more psychologically based. So, when you're a child, 80% of children who start stuttering will spontaneously recover. So, even if they've not had any treatment at all, 80% of them will recover and they'll never stutter again. But the early treatment that we have nowadays is very, very, very successful.
Yeah.
We don't know why. Again, not enough research into the area. We have this wonderful, wonderful program called Lidcombe program, and it's based on bringing the child's attention to the fact that they stutter, and then getting them to remediate that, and getting parents to bring attention to it as well, parent training. And it's very, very successful. We don't know why, unfortunately.
Is it an urban myth, or does it happen, like you said, got like a nervous onset for stuttering, we can do? Is that a trigger itself? Have they identified triggers?
Oh, thank you so much for bringing that up. My study is on migrants who stutter. So the whole basis of that is that migrancy itself, coming from one country to another as you go, is a very stressful opportunity. It's a very stressful thing to happen to someone. It's a very, very stressful experience. There's a lot of things that go into planning of it, doing it, and then settling into a new country when you get over, especially if you're on your own. Very, very stressful experience. Stuttering itself has this horrible, horrible circle where stress will cause the stutter to get worse, the stuttering getting worse will cause stress, and so on. It's this vicious, vicious circle. So stuttering itself is very stressful. So we want to see what that combined stress of stuttering and the stress of migration, what happens when they come together, and what the experiences are of those people who have migrated, who stutter, how they experience that, how they've been able to settle into the new country, specifically Australia.
Okay.
Specifically Australia.
So before I ask you about your results, I'm really curious. You said you got all these interviews secondhand. Where did they come from?
So I came onto the project after data collection had occurred. Okay. So I came in after a PhD candidate from Curtin University had been brought on board to do all of the data collection herself. She's it was interesting actually, and this is part of limitations in that she's a quantitative researcher and she'd never done any qualitative work, she'd never done interviews before. So myself and one of my other supervisors, who's a highly prolific researcher in qualitative studies in speech pathology and aphasia, we listen back to the interviews and keep thinking, oh, I would have asked this, I would have gone more into this. So, she had done the interviews. Some of them were in loud cafes, and you can imagine these people, a lot of them were bilingual. English is a second language. So, English is a second language, stuttering in a loud environment, and I haven't done the interviews. So transcription was tricky.
That could be hard. I'm learning all this interview stuff as we're doing the show. Yes. So I might pick your brain after for some tips.
Sure. But it made it quite tricky for me. For somebody who has, for example, one of the participants was a lady from Nepal. Yep. She had a very strong Nepalese accent. Her English was probably a 5 out of 10. She had a very severe stutter. And she was in a very loud cafe.
Wow. How'd that one go?
Yeah, about an hour and 10 minutes of interview that took me about 2 months to transcribe.
2 months?
Keeping in mind I was on prac, I was on full-time prac, but that was very, very difficult.
That must have been stressful.
I kept leaving and coming back to it, and because we had, how many? I think 4 males from the UK, so they were quite easy to transcribe, even with their stutter. We had a lady from Nepal. We had a man who, and I'll tell you a bit more about him in a second, but he's a refugee from Afghanistan who came here by boat from Pakistan. We had 2 males from India. We had a lady who was originally from Sri Lanka, and we had a lady who was from France originally, who moved to the UK and then came to Australia.
I can see what you mean by definitely nails.
Yes.
Like, they're definitely more nails in that.
Yes. And interestingly enough, probably the only reason that we had quite a high proportion of males in the study itself, which is obviously explained by the high proportion of males in the population of stutterers, but at the same time, the reason that we had as many females as we did, I think, we had 3 out of 9, which is, probably more than would normally happen in a stuttering study, is that the participants the idea for the study actually came from a previous honours study that was looking into women who stutter and their experiences.
Okay.
So we used some of the participants from that who had talked about their experiences of migration, which sort of sparked the idea for the study.
Yeah.
So we used them, and then we recruited some more people through the Speechy Association.
So what did you find out? If this fluency, I have no idea. I couldn't even speculate.
Well, see, it was a very interesting study, and it was an exploratory study. I will preface with that, because it is such a wide subject, and it's a subject that really hasn't been looked into before. It might sound, because only about 1% of the population stutters in the percentage of the world.
Yeah, that's still a lot of people.
It's still a lot of people, exactly. In Australia, it works out to be 270,000 people, thereabouts, that stutter in Australia. But keeping in mind the clinical utility of this for speech pathologists in Australia, we're a highly, highly multicultural country. So it's very, very likely that anyone working in the area of fluency, which is most speech pathologists, will come across somebody who has migrated from somewhere else. On probably quite a high proportion of times, there will be somebody who, because we work in such a multicultural area.
Yeah.
So it's very likely that you will. So clinically, for speech pathologists, it's actually quite, useful for us to be able to know this. Excuse me. What was the question?
We're going into your we're finding out what you found out.
Yes. So exploratory study. A lot of really, really interesting stuff came out from it. So there's a lot of work into bilingualism and stuttering, and as to whether or not people stutter more in their second language or their first language, what parts of the languages have an impact on the stuttering. So we had some stories about bilingualism and how, for us, it was more about English language learning. So the people who spoke English as a second language had that additional layer, and that's what we're looking at in the results of this, that there is this layering effect. So, and it's sort of what you would expect, I guess, when you have a stutter, very stressful, you migrate, very stressful, so there's just this layer upon layer of stresses as people have to deal with. And for the people who had to learn English as a second language, they come over from India, from Nepal, from France, from Afghanistan or Pakistan, and they've had to learn English as a second language. Not only do they stutter, so that's a communication barrier in itself. They don't speak the language. They don't know anyone here. They have the stress arising from the stutter, which we know impacts on their self-esteem, on their confidence, and their ability to step out of their comfort zone. So, there's just this layering of stresses, and we found that, interestingly though, the people who spoke English as a second language obviously had to learn that language. The people from England, and this is really interesting, although they didn't have a language difference, they had an accent difference, obviously. And that sort of acted as a little bit of a separator, I guess, sort of made them feel like an other.
Okay. For
a couple of the guys.
You're talking about strong, I suppose, strong English accents that are coming from...
He's from Newcastle.
Newcastle. Okay, cool. If any of the listeners haven't heard anyone from Newcastle, give them a Google. That's in Birmingham.
Just YouTube that and see how you go. He doesn't have a strong accent now, so I could actually transcribe him, which was really good. He'd been over here for a few years, but he said when he first came over that was a real barrier, because that's what we're looking at, barriers to how these stresses and things are a barrier for people being able to settle into the new country, being able to come here and not feel like an other, not feel like someone from somewhere else, feel like an Australian, feel like you can make a home here and you can settle, and that's the whole point. And for him, his accent was a real barrier to that, because it was a point of difference, and it was a very obvious point of difference, just like his stutter. So stutter was an obvious point of difference, but his accent was as well. And he had to find a way of modifying that accent, of toning it down, because it really frustrated him when people come up to him and say, "Oh, you've got a strong accent, don't you?" And although that might seem quite innocuous to us, especially as Australians who, maybe not yourself, but, as Australians who come from a country where our accent is very, very similar, from one side to the other, very homogenous. For a person who comes from England, he talked about this being a sense of identity for him. It was really interesting.
It is,
isn't it?
In my own household, between my siblings, my parents, at least most of us have a very different accent from each other, depending on how we grew up, who we hung out with. Bear in mind, if we hung out with maybe the town over, we may have picked up a bit of that. Where we went, if we went to university, if we went to college, depending on that, what we did as an education, and where we worked after, have all severely impacted. And that's just in a household, let alone a state and outwards.
Exactly. And it was so interesting to hear him talk about this. It's a sense of identity for him. In the UK, there's a completely different culture surrounding accent than it is to here. I couldn't tell you if someone's from New South Wales. I could maybe tell you if they were from Queensland, if they were an older generation, because my mum's from Queensland. I have a very strong nasally accent. But apart from that, and I've got a good ear for it, but apart from that, it's not something that we really focus on. So for him, coming over from a place where that was a sense of identity, I'm from Newcastle, and it's this sort of a bringing together, we're from Newcastle, a we thing, to have that sense of identity and pride as well, arising just in the way that you speak, coming over to Australia and having us sort of go, "Oh, you've got a strange accent, don't you? Where do you come from?" He found that really frustrating, because it was a way of identifying him as an other. It was different. And being someone who stutters, you've always grown up as different. You've always been different, and that's always been very negative. So I think for him that was, and that's just me speculating, that's not something he said very specifically. But me speculating, I think that was really impactful for him to be seen as an other. It was really interesting to see that in the Caucasian population, as well as these people who come from other backgrounds where they are actually physically different as well. So there were some experiences of racism, unfortunately, of discrimination. So that's another layer, that these people come from different culture, so they're discriminated based on their culture as well as their speech. And interestingly, the people who had experienced racism based on their culture, but discrimination based on their speech and their stutter wasn't experienced as much. So Australians were actually seen as quite accepting of a disability, as we call it, even though stuttering isn't necessarily recognised as a disability as such. They were experiencing, the Australians were very accepting, very supportive of people, even if they didn't know. And there was that lack of awareness as well. Lack of awareness all over. From every country there was a lack of awareness of what stuttering is, of how people experience it, hence the utility of the study. But at the same time, even though we were unaware, the Australians were very accepting, very supportive, and that was different to people in the UK and also people in non-Western countries as well. So people in the UK were actually less accepting. They were less aware and they were less accepting, but people here were very supportive, very accepting, from workmates and colleagues to friends, to a beautiful story that one of the participants spoke about of his landlord that actually said, "Oh, I've noticed that you've started, I don't want to say stuttering because that would be offensive." Interesting that he noted that it would be offensive to say stuttering. I don't want to say stuttering, but your speech has been getting a little bit bad. I'll take you out to karaoke. Because you can, if you sing, you don't stutter when you sing, which is actually, it's not an old wives' tale. People do not stutter when they sing, which is interesting because when you sing, your language actually comes from a different part of your brain than when you speak. So, hence the neurological basis as
that
well.
is really interesting. I've heard that before, but again, you just kind of shrugged off and said,
you do.
Really?
It's true. Yeah. So they look at the rhythmic side of singing as being really helpful, but also because we draw language from a different area of our brain.
There's singing therapy as well, isn't there? There's something when people stutter quite a lot, you just get them to do... Google it.
Google it. There's a beautiful video of a young boy in the UK, I think, who stutters, and he's being taught by his music teacher. He has headphones on, and he's singing. Or he's singing, or he might be reading something in a rhythmic way. He's not stuttering at all.
That's fascinating.
Very severe stutterer. Megan Washington is a beautiful example. She's an Australian musician. She has a stutter. She did a TED talk. We'll look her up. But yeah, you can see that she does have a stutter. She manages it well, but she stutters. And she's a singer, and she has a stutter in it. And
that's incredible.
Beautiful, beautiful controlled voice. And so that's very interesting. And so going back to this story, this landlord said, let's go back to karaoke and I'll help you feel better. And so that was a beautiful example of how people are really supportive in Australia. But that's the interesting thing. They were supportive of the disability, but not of the culture, not of the cultural difference.
That's bizarre.
It is. Yeah. It's really bizarre, and it also really highlights something there that I think is, I guess, anecdotally evident.
Yeah.
That, we do have a little bit of a problem in Australia with cultural difference.
Mm-hmm. Which is odd in itself, considering that migration to Australia is incredibly high, not just from people who are sick of the rain, like myself, coming from the UK, but you've got people from Indonesia and other aspects of Asia coming down. A lot of cultures coming to one area, especially when the population of Australia itself is minuscule compared to some capital countries.
Yes, yeah. Well, we're in the top 3 most multicultural countries in the world, but I would argue that we're multinational, not multicultural, in that we have a lot of nationalities. They're not necessarily accepting of assimilation in terms of culture. But I think that this study in particular did highlight that. I mean, it's a small study, don't get me wrong. Yeah. That's something that we made perfectly clear in the study itself. I'm still waiting the results back, and it will be published eventually, but we made it very clear.
Need a larger sample size.
Well, not necessarily. That it's a small sample size, but that is how we're able to get into these stories. I can see obviously the utility in having a large sample size for quantitative studies where you are trying to make generalizations across populations is very, very important. You need to have a large sample size to be able to say this data is true across a large sample of individuals, and you can then draw conclusions from that and be relatively confident in the fact that those conclusions are true. What we're not looking at making generalizations. We're not looking at trying to put this across populations. We're literally just trying to look at these experiences of these people and really look really deeply into that. And that's part of the methodology. We did some IP, so interpretive phenomenology. Really hard to say, even as a speechy. Interpretative phenomenology, IP. So I'm not
even going to try.
No, good. That's why I always wrote it as IP. So I can just say that. But that idea is that we are interpreting a phenomenon. So we are listening to stories, and I'm reinterpreting those stories into my paper. So I've heard these experiences, I'm taking those experiences, I'm trying to interpret that in a way that when I put it down on paper, you can really get a nice composite picture of these experiences, what it actually looks like for a person who stutters, who's come to Australia. What does it look like when you do that?
So what did you find out when you said these, I suppose, accumulated layers of stress from, the multicultural aspect and the stress of migration, the bilingualism? What did you find out that this accumulation did? Did they also, and the other thing I want to know is, did they stutter in one language? For the ones that are bilingual, did they stutter in their native language and not their second, or vice versa?
Yeah, okay, I'll start on that one because that's probably a quicker way of doing it. But, and like I said, there's a lot of studies that have gone into bilingualism and stuttering. I'm really interested in that. But for the participants of this study, we found that they were very, very self-aware. I think that comes from the fact that we did sample them from the Speakeasy Association, which is they get together in a group of stutterers and they speak about their treatment, they speak about their techniques, and they practice together. So I think that sort of gives you a sample of people who are very, very highly aware. But it gave us sort of these people who were highly aware of the different aspects of language and how they could modify that language to be able to suit their stuttering. So some people talked about, and these were people who spoke multiple languages, not just their native and English. These are people from Nepal, for example, who spoke multiple dialects. The man from Afghanistan spoke 6 different languages, ridiculous amounts. But they were able to look at the different sounds that we use, the different tones of these languages, the tonal languages, the different speeds. They were able to modify their language use to be able to make their stuttering less severe. So I guess in answer to your question, though, there were a few people who spoke about, there was one lady, like the lady from Nepal, who spoke very interestingly about the fact that her native language, I think it was Malwari, but she spoke about that being very highly focused on vowels, whereas in English she used more consonants. And look, there are differences in phonetics between languages that we know about, and she had recognised that with no training, and was able to say, look, I stutter more in that language, in my native language, than I do in English, because I stutter more on vowels, or I stutter more on consonants. And so these people were able to pick that up and notice. And there's no hard and fast rule whether or not they stutter more in their native language or in their second language. We think it's probably based on the language itself, and also the person themselves as to what parts of the language might trigger their stutter. So it can be either way. I have a friend who is a stutterer. He's from a Slavic country that doesn't exist anymore. But, he stutters more in his native language than he does in English. So it varies from person to person, and that is the thing to really understand about stuttering, and why this study itself is very, very good to do, because we know that stuttering is so variable from person to person. It is experienced in so many different ways. Somebody who might rate on a subjective assessment of severity of stuttering that we do as a speech pathologist might be very, very severe, but they might only experience it as a mild stutter. For whatever reason, they experience it as a mild stutter. It doesn't have that much of an impact on their lives, and we think that has to do with their personality. Whereas somebody who has a very mild stutter, that might impact on their lives incredibly. They might see it as a very severe stutter, even though it's really only perceptively mild. So it's experienced in so many different ways, and that's why this sort of a study is really important, to be able to look into these individual experiences and see them as individual experiences, and gain what we can from that. So what was the second part of your question? You were asking about the bilingualism. And
the second part was the accumulation.
Yes. Yeah. So from that, the second part of the results was, just like you said, how they dealt with this. So an interesting point that came out of it was, and I highlighted this in the further research section, was this idea of resilience. There's a lot of research into resilience by a guy called Irving Goffman, and he is a sociologist. He does a lot of work into the idea of resilience as a personality trait. And I thought it was really interesting to sort of see this in the context of stutterers. I guess this kind of this whole study served as a bit of a case study almost. So you've taken some stutterers, you've chucked them in a highly, highly stressful situation and seen what they did. And they all came out as being very, very resilient. And the idea of resilience is that in the face of overwhelming odds, they've still managed to have positive outcomes. So although these people are dealing with high, high degrees of stress from both their stuttering and their migration and the interaction between those two, that they have still managed to find a way out, whether that be through the Speechy Association. A lot of people talked about the importance of having support networks, whether that be family members. A lot of them didn't have family members. That was one of the layers, that they've been separated from their support networks. Making friends with their, their landlord, having support networks from colleagues, or simply going to the Speechy Association and being able to speak with other people who stutter. So that was a really, really strong theme in terms of what people were doing to help them deal with these problems. I think a lot of people spoke about focusing on the psychological basis. And like I said, that comes into the definition of stutter in itself, that there is a very highly psychological aspect to stuttering. We know that. And it can't be ignored. And these people were talking about how treatment in their home countries, even in the UK, was more focused on the impairment. So we talk about treatment in terms of impairment focus and functional focus. Mm-hmm. Impairment is like your doctor. You've got a problem, I'm going to fix it. Yeah. It's a physical issue and I'm going to fix that. And that was the focus that a lot of people found in the non-Western countries. And also in the UK as well, they would really just focus on, this is the problem, we're going to help you fix it. In Australia, we were more holistic in that we looked at that, but we also looked at the functional impact and how we can really look at this psychological impact, how this stress is affecting you and how we can also focus on that. So
you almost took the approach of a physiotherapist and an occupational therapist in the approach that you, at least in Australia, take.
Yeah, and that's a largely allied health approach in Australia. I think a lot of the training in Australia for allied health professions is focused on this idea of quality of life. Mm-hmm. And this framework called the ICF, and it's been made by the World Health Organization, International Classification of Functioning. So it's a way of, it's a framework that looks at impairment, but also the impact of this impairment in terms of the physical side of things and the impact of it on your quality of life, how you're able to participate in certain situations, what activities is the barrier to, and how does it affect, what barriers are there in terms of your environment. So it's a way of looking at that, and I think that's the training that we're looking at in Australia in terms of allied health professions, OT, physio, speech, which all work very together, is that we're looking at that, and we have to implement that in all of our treatment. All of our treatment must be looking at the impairment and also how it impacts on the person's life.
Yeah.
And how can we help mediate that? It's not just OTs looking at how can we make your life better. Speechies are doing it as well.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
That is really fantastic.
It is.
So, two things I want to ask before we go away. First one, what's your plans from now? Are you going to go into a clinical and try and get employed, or are you going to go into research?
Clinical.
Get some money?
Get some money. Yeah, look, like I said, I've been offered to do my PhD next year, but PhDs are expensive and you don't get a lot of money out of them.
No, you don't.
No, and you look, that's something you really have to consider when you're looking at going into further research. If you're looking at being an academic, I think that's something you have to consider and really think about. That you won't be earning a lot.
No, you won't. But it's always something you can go back to. It's going to be the scholar. I suppose it's like a recognition of a scholar.
Yes.
And you can always go back to it. And getting industry experience is always going to help that. It might come up with more ideas. You might be able to think of new approaches.
Exactly.
So that's always something. Hopefully you might be able to answer them quickly. I'll say them both. Does personality, so their confidence, affect a person's ability to handle stutter, or even are more confident people less likely to have stuttering?
Okay.
The second one is something I have an issue with. I kind of stop talking at points. I kind of go back in my head.
Yeah.
Is there a stutter or a thing where you're almost talking faster than your brain outputs? Perfectly demonstrated in that. So is there a form of stuttering or a form of fluidity that is caused or is defined by talking faster than your brain processes?
I'm going to say it's not a form of stuttering.
Okay.
I guess in the context of this study in particular, a lot of people were talking about how they would stutter more in English at the start when they were learning it because there's this idea of cognitive load. Mm-hmm. So your brain can only do so many things at once. It's a machine, and it can only do so many things at once. This whole idea of multitasking is not true. People don't necessarily multitask. It's a theory that you can only give you have 100% of your cognitive load, and you can only give so much of that to so many different tasks. When someone's learning a language, a high degree of your cognitive load is based on getting the words together, formulating a sentence and bringing it out in that new language. It's very, very difficult when you're not fluent. When you're fluent, you're not thinking about it. You're literally just doing it as you think. when you speak this English as a second language, you're not fluent. You're having to really think about it. So a high degree of their cognitive load is based on speaking that language. So they were talking about how their brain formulating it would take too long, they would get confused and they would stutter. They would stutter more because of the cognitive load really being spent on that language learning. But I guess what you're talking about in terms of your brain working faster than your mouth can, that is, if we look at it in terms of, we talk about theoretical frameworks of thinking in terms of language production and speech production. We look at a lot of theories of frameworks of this sort of thing. And a lot of them are sort of based around this idea that and this is the process, you come up with an idea that you want to talk about something, you come up with a motive, you want to talk about something. You have all these words in your lexicon and your vocabulary, you have them all stuck up here. Your brain has to get the words that you need, it has to select them from that, we call it like a filing cabinet.
Yep.
It has to take all the words out, it has to put them in the right order, and it has to work out the sounds that you need to make those words. So if I wanted to say, hello, how are you? My brain needs to go, okay, so I need to say hello, how are you? I need to say hello, then how, then then you. I'm going to need to do a h at the start and then an e and so on.
Yeah.
So you need to select the sounds and then you need to make your muscles do that.
Okay.
So there's this transition stage from neurological picking of things and your brain then telling your muscles to do something. So there's this muscular control and this neurological control.
Yeah.
And I guess that sometimes your muscles can't always move as quickly as your brain wants it to.
Yeah.
So there's a disorder called apraxia. This is a disorder that often results from traumatic brain injury or stroke. It's a mucking up of this programming of your muscles to do things. And your muscles will do the wrong thing. So I guess, and there's also another disorder that will cause your muscles to be quite slow. So you might lose the ability to move your muscles to make the sounds that you need to make. So these people who have this disorder, whether it's resulted from TBI or stroke or whatever, their brain is telling them, okay, you need to make these sounds, perfectly fine all up there. It's telling your muscles to do things and your muscles are really slow. It might be people with MS, I work with people with MS, people with Huntington's, they have this disorder, their muscles won't do what their brain wants them to do. And so their brain is working faster than their muscles can move. And so that actually comes out quite slowed. So, yeah, you have to sort of see it in terms of this neurological control and your muscular control and how well that can be coordinated. Okay. If that makes any sense.
No, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, okay.
No, that really does.
Yeah. Yes, and the other side.
And the other one was the confidence and personality.
That comes into the idea of resilience, I think. And again, what came out of this study is that it's possible that stutterers are innately, because of their experiences, are innately resilient people. And part of that is their personality traits. And I think part of that is confidence. I mean, one of the questions that we had in the interviews was, what are the positive aspects that have come out of stuttering? We talk a lot about the negative aspects and the stresses and the impacts that we've had. What are the positive aspects, if any? And most of the time people came out with, well, I think I push myself, I think I push myself out of my comfort zone. I think I do things I wouldn't necessarily have done before because I want to better myself. So it's sort of this contradictory thing that while stuttering has this massive impact, and we saw this again in the interviews, on their self-esteem, on their confidence, on their self-worth, it really sort of pushed that down. At the same time, these people are willing to push themselves out of their comfort zones, and that may be because of where we sampled them from. Again, we sampled them from the Speakeasy Association. These are people that have gone out of their way to find support.
Yep.
However, it still begs the question, have these people been pushed to be doers? Are they doers? They're migrants. They come across from somewhere else. That's such a big thing that most of us won't do in our lifetime. And I think that sort of begs the question, are they doers? Are they people who, while their confidence has been smushed down, was that a pushing and a challenging factor? Was the stuttering itself that has pushed them down their whole lives enough to really push them to be more than they could have been?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
Yeah, so while they all identify as having low self-confidence and low self-esteem and low self-worth, it does make you wonder.
So the life experiences have forced them to confront and be proactive about not just their impairment or their issue, but also to apply that resilience they've learned from that into other aspects of life, and then
absolutely, yeah, exactly right. And that's the thing we had to see at the end of this, that the people of this study, people who come across from overseas, who migrate to Australia, they don't come in a vacuum, they don't come in a bubble. They come with a wealth of experiences, and a lot of the time these are very similar experiences of bullying, of discrimination based on their stutter, that has shaped them into these individuals that they are. And yeah, I guess that it makes you wonder, okay, you've had these experiences that have caused you to really have low self-confidence, but has that also really pushed you to want to be better?
Yeah.
Because what else can you do? What else can you do when you get to rock bottom? When you've been pushed down, either you crawl up into a ball, and somebody actually said that, you feel like crawling into a ball and not coming out. Mm-hmm. Beautiful words. Either you do that, or, you get better. And yeah,
that's a beautiful end point. I think, because I usually ask for a take-home message, and I think if anything,
I think that's a good one.
That's a perfect one to have. Well, thank you very much, Claire, for coming on the show. Yeah, and if you guys and the listeners enjoyed the show, please check out our website at vaguelyaccurate.com. Like us and share us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And if you know anyone who is studying and doing research and would be interested in coming onto the show to feature for an episode, encourage them to contact us. You can get in contact on our Facebook page, or you can get in touch via vaguecomments@gmail.com. As always, I'd like to do a shout out for our 8 podcasts. I think I should be featuring on one of the fellow shows up there called Coup de Cast, so check that out. They're really cool guys. Talk about pretty much just nerdy stuff. It's not so much trivia, it's just what have you been playing, what's new, but it's worth checking them out. So check out that and Ace Podcast itself. Cheers guys, and see you next time.